we're here with Dr. Andy Soria, and if you wanted to give a brief bio of your background.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm Andy Soria. I'm basically professor of wood chemistry and environmental science and technology at UAF and UAA. And within my role as wood chemist, I basically study biomass and the possibility of transforming it into hydrocarbons that can replace basically petroleum products. And so within that framework, I work in gasification, I work in liquefaction, I work in production of bio-oil, and in production of biodiesel. All of them are considered thermal-chemical conversion pathways, and that's a big word. Thermal is temperature, chemical is chemical. And so it's a combination of temperature, pressure, and chemistry in order to take basically any type of biomass, break it apart, tear out the chemical species, and try to recraft them in such a way that we get products that we can then either use directly as a fuel or fuel additive or as plastic or resin or just about anything you can think of at least petroleum for, or as a feedstock for another type of conversion that will then basically for the production of those end products. It's not particularly sexy as far as a career path. It's kind of dirty most of the time. But it is, for all intents and purposes, the only avenue that we can foreseeably, in a very long-term future, continue to have essentially our plastics or rubbers or fuels or asphalts or paints or anything else that will rely on hydrocarbons, not necessarily because petroleum is going to run out. Simply it's going to be too expensive for us to basically do our manufacturing for other things. And so biomass, out of all the alternative options, is actually the only one that natively is capable of producing hydrocarbons. And that you can actually go down the list of all renewables, from solar, wind, geothermal, go down the entire list. You produce electrons. That's fantastic. We get electricity out of it. But we don't necessarily manufacture based on electricity, we manufacture our goods based on our ability to actually have a tangible product that we can manipulate as a computer or as a something else. And that is a permanent electron. And so that's sort of why I do what I do. It's kind of thinking very long term when the economics of hydrocarbons, traditional fossil-based hydrocarbons, then our only alternative may actually have to be biomass. This is the only one we have, or at least so far, identified as a potential native source of the same raw materials that go into making all of the hydrocarbon products.
So when you're the byproducts, the hydrocarbons that you get from the gasification, is it just as easy to take that hydrocarbons, that the byproducts that it makes, and turn them into plastics as it is from, say, straight petroleum? Or is it more labor intensive right now?
Not really. The problem that we have is not that. Okay, so let me kind of put the petroleum into a picture. Petroleum in itself is a mixture of hundreds of different biomass end products. They've been mineralized over millions of years. And so we put them into this massive boiling pot that is a refinery. And based on their condensing temperature, the temperature that they go from the gas into a liquid phase, we get different fractions. However, from those fractions in a normal refinery, we pipe them and we chop them even further. Because at least in North America, we consume more gasoline distillates than, let's say, Europe. They produce more diesel. And so in the States, refineries sacrifice diesel by chopping it off and adding essentially hydrogen and chopping off carbon-carbon bonds. I didn't say how much, but putting the carbon that's attached to another carbon, that bond gets chopped and the hydrogen is attached to it. Okay. The smaller the molecule, generally speaking, the more volatile it is. And volatile, basically, compounds are what we drive on, right? They're very kind of explosive in nature. And so our refineries are kind of tilted towards producing gasoline distillates, which are kind of small chunks. From gasification, we can actually take the end streams, which are carbon monoxide, that's the product we actually truly absolutely want. And from that carbon monoxide, if our reaction conditions are good enough, we can actually, it's called a water shift phase reaction, we can actually take water, H2O, and under very intense conditions of heat, they actually shift off and hydrogen gets emitted. And so on a normal gasification of biomass, we lack a little bit the temperature range that is required for that full water shift phase reaction to occur. But under ideal circumstances, kind of what you read in the textbooks, you will be able to produce carbon monoxide and hydrogen. Well, you have the two main building blocks because based on catalysts, we can use nickel, cobalt, and other things. We then take that carbon and that oxygen bond, chop it in half, and put a hydrogen next to it. Well, that's exactly what I just described we do in a normal petroleum refinery. And that's exactly the type of product we get. However, from these type of reactions, the product range is not as broad as what we get from petroleum. And so in our case, when we try to do gasification to liquid fuels, we end up having a lot of benzene being formed, we end up having a lot of paraffins being formed, which are actually very good feedstocks to then put in a normal petroleum refinery. So you can actually take them to a petroleum refinery and they will be happy to accept it because they're saving actually in the process. And then we can get basically the same product. So from that standpoint, it becomes kind of an intermediary end product. Benzene is one of the major components of gasoline, but it's not the only component. And so from the gasification process, you can produce a lot of different petroleum-like products. And depending on how the refiner, so when you take the intermediary part, depending on what process the refiner is doing, you can then create plastics, you can then create rubber, you can create whatever other products you may have. But getting to that kind of universal intermediary continues to be an active R&D effort because, again, there's a lot of variability in biomass. Not all trees are equal, right? Not all biomass is equal. And as a result, you not only have this potential for really getting CO2 and really getting hydrogen, but you're getting also a mixture of compounds that are not, CO, carbon monoxide is just one C. So you may have things with 5 to 10 to 12 to 14 C's on it. They're massive, right? Comparatively speaking. And those are actually your parts.
Oh, okay.
And part of the reason why they remained there is they were originally even a much bigger part of the biomass. They were actually the solid material, which can have 100 to 200,000 carbons on it. Right? As you thoroughly break this down in the gasification process, it doesn't quite cut that really super long chain down to a single carbon. And those kind of longer carbon chains then make their way outside of the reactor, basically the hot temperature to the point, not being able to cut themselves even further. And there is really it's a very big technical challenge to try to filter them out because it's a game of statistics. The chances of you producing these are pretty high, and it's 100% certain that they're going to come out along with your carbon monoxide, which is kind of what you want. Now, the larger molecules are your tars, but you do have between, let's say, C1 and C6, so 6 carbons down to 1 carbon, you have those compounds being volatile by nature. So they're flammable. And that's a very good thing. As well as your larger, slightly larger, probably up to C14, as long as they remain in the gas phase of the exit, you can put a match to it and they will light. And so it allows for not perfect reactions to still produce a flame that you can then heat things like water and send it off for distribution. Or you can use it for process heat, or you can use it for anything else. I apologize.
That's okay.
And so you're able to kind of get away with less of a penalty with heating applications currently because of that kind of terminator setup.
So without jumping ahead, one of the issues as far as for internal combustion engines is what you're saying is because when it's the longer chains that are like the tars, as long as they're in the gas, you can still burn them. But when they're going into the engine, that's when they're starting to collect up within the engine,
right?
Kind of.
And so here's the deal. So if you look at the engine, internal combustion, for sure, right? So you have, my hand would be the piston, we have the sleeve. You basically have a compression stroke. That in that compression stroke, basically, when the piston goes down, you have the input of air. You need a certain amount of air for obviously combustion to occur, and then your fuel gets fed. In the moment that the piston comes in, that actually gets heated, right? And so that process, which can happen in milliseconds, depending on the RPM of your car. That process is designed so that when the piston hits top dead center, there's a spark that ignites that mixture of air and fuel and pushes the piston down at the bottom. And that's actually what's the driving portion. Then the neighborhood piston does the same thing, and that allows this to go back up. And the moment it goes back up, all of those combustion gases are pushed out, the valves open, then the exhaust valve gets out, and then it drops back in. However, as odd as it sounds, very high energy intensity explosion, right? It pushes the piston down. That cools things off. That's exactly where the input of fuel happens to be. And when you cool these things on a surface like the sleeve of the cylinder, they deposit themselves as tars. And so your rings, your piston rings, begin actually scouring and begin just kind of having a hard time getting through because you're suddenly coating all of that as well as your valves. And everybody goes to the gas station, there's a new additive, and they show the old valve and the new valve. Well, that can happen within 10 minutes. If you have a lot of tars. And you can imagine that's just the gases coming out. You can imagine actually the moving parts being stressed to the point that they will fail. And they will fail.
The engine seizes up and you're pretty much having to rebuild the whole thing.
Yeah.
So.
And so you have that under ideal circumstances. Under real circumstances, the issue is that gasification gas doesn't have the BTU power that vapor phase gasoline will have in the combustion chamber, which basically means that your explosion and the energy that is actually released by that spark lighting the fuel or the mixture, it's not as vigorous.
Okay.
Being not as vigorous also means it's not as hot. And being not as hot means this cooling, condensing effect is more likely to happen. You also have the difficulty in controlling when the ignition happens. So on normal gasoline cars, internal combustion engines for sure, you have a spark that goes dead top center, it sparks, right? But gasification gas can run in both internal combustion engine, both gasoline and diesel. On the diesel end of things, you have an interesting thing happening. That is, you don't have a spark plug that actually creates the explosion, but rather when the piston comes up, that compression of the air and the fuel is enough that it self-ignites.
Oh, okay.
And so that's why diesel engines never have a spark plug. They don't need it because the fuel itself, when it gets compressed, it goes boom. And so they're designed for basically that precise moment where the piston is near, not at dead top, but near, where the explosion happens, and then off it goes. But what happens if you put another fuel like gasification gas into it that may actually have an ignition either through compression or through the heat, because when the piston goes up and down, every time you compress a gas, everybody has filled kind of tire pumps, those little, the little tire pump that you put in for a bicycle. And if you start pumping and pumping and pumping, as soon as you begin having resistance, that whole tire pump will get just terribly hot. And that's because you're basically trying to force compressed air into already a compressed air chamber, which is a tire. So the same analogy applies. If you actually are trying to compress this gas, it may be that before it actually hits top dead center, it goes boom. But still your piston has to finish before it can go down. So you're having the maximum explosion before it's like go point.
Oh, okay.
Or if there's too little BTU value on it because you didn't control the moisture or the biomass rate was poor.
So it's overshooting it?
Yeah.
So that's going to really...
It may not even explode. And so if it doesn't explode, then guaranteed you're going to have all of this stuff depositing on the surface. And so you basically are potentially playing kind of Russian roulette.
Okay.
And internal combustion engines, they're not difficult to rebuild. They're costly.
Yeah.
And ultimately, if you're dealing with failures because the rings just basically were stressed to the point every time they can going up and down, that behavior will not necessarily go away. So it's an issue partly because these gases are not true petroleum byproducts unless you do unless you really transform them into it. The fact that they may run in an internal combustion engine is one thing. The fact that they will likely break it is another, right? And so if you don't turn them into the petroleum byproduct, you don't have necessarily the lubricity effect, so lubricating effect. Things will develop from that. And I'll show you some of the tars that come out.
It's kind of a case of just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah. And then there's another problem. And this is kind of it's not really a problem per se, because engines can deal with that. When we're dealing with gasoline, like everybody right now driving down the road, you can actually look at the tailpipe and see water coming out. Mm-hmm. Right? Well, the water is the normal end product of combustion. So an ideal combustion, textbook combustion, is you take a carbon-containing material, so hydrocarbon, hydrogen, carbon, so carbon and hydrogen. So you take those guys, and the carbon gets chopped, and you attach oxygen. In fact, we're breathing right now, and you get CO2. The hydrogen gets chopped, you attach oxygen to it, and you get H2O. So the end products of combustion are carbon dioxide and water. The problem that we have with biomass is that sometimes the biomass has a lot of water, and then it's like trying to light up a wet bonfire. Mm-hmm. You simply don't get up to the temperatures, you simply don't get the system to actually operate correctly. But when you're dealing with internal combustion engines, water robs enormous amounts of heat from the entire system. And so your efficiency will just